Hello everyone, so welcome back. Today I wanted to speak a little bit about the stages of spiritual development, or waking up and then cleaning up. Before I get into that topic, I wanted to thank all of my patrons on Patreon. This is the community who makes these talks possible by supporting me with monthly contributions that allow me to approach these sharings in these talks on YouTube as a job, as part of my job. Otherwise, I would simply be too busy teaching yoga all over town to have time to sit down and record these talks. So even though these are very modest, I don't have fancy production or fancy lighting or anything like that. Actually is quite a lot of work that goes into just creating one of these talks. So much gratitude and thanks to that community that support me. Okay, so the stages of spiritual development, or waking up and then cleaning up, these are related topics that we're going to explore in today's talk. So the first thing I'd like to get out of the way is there's not one spiritual path. There isn't one way that happens, the spiritual awakening happens for everybody. There's no rules. One can wake up or become enlightened just any number of ways. But there are patterns, there are things that are perhaps more common for most people, and then there are exceptions. One unfortunate thing that happens in spirituality, and I think this happens just with human beings in general, is the exception tends to get glorified and amplified. So the exception tends to make a really good story, and so very often that's what we fixate on. If you're a professional musician, most professional musicians aren't U2 or the Red Hot Chili Peppers or Beyonce. Most professional musicians play weddings, or they play frat houses, or they play pubs and bars. They are driving around the country, many of them, in a little van, driving through the night to get to the next venue, and they make just enough money to pay gas and eat food and maybe stay in a grungy hotel, but probably not, maybe once every now and then they're off to the next gig. So that's the reality for most musicians, professional musicians, people who are making their living doing that. But what do we think of when we think of a professional musician? We think of, again, maybe Bono or Beyonce or somebody like that, who's in the top, like tiny percent, the superstars of music. This is what we think of when we think of a professional musician very often. So I think this happens in all areas of human endeavor, including spirituality. We tend to take that 1%. We read autobiography of a yogi and we think, oh, okay, that's what spirituality looks like. We read Eckhart Tolle's work and we think, oh, okay, what happened to me happened to him didn't happen to me, so I must not be awake or enlightened. Byron Katie is another example of that. So this talk, I'm hoping to just sort of clear up a little bit of that. And again, right off the bat, I want to say there isn't one way. So what I'm going to talk about today is something that happens for many people, but it's by no means rigid. It doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong or there's something off with your path if this isn't what you've experienced or are experiencing. This is just meant to be helpful. This may be what you're experiencing, and it might help clarify for you maybe where you put your energy in your spirituality, for lack of a better way of putting it. I'm almost getting to the point where I don't really like that term. I'm going to probably continue to use it because it is useful. But really, for me, the longer I do this work, this is just about being human and being alive, how to maximize our potential in this human life. And that potential is for peace, for joy, for feeling the full range of what we can experience as a human being, which includes sadness, grief, and anger, and all the other beautiful emotions that we can experience. I almost think of these as like colors. And so we're painting in our life with these colors. We're co-creating with other human beings, and we're bringing in these different shades of color, and that makes a human life very rich and very interesting. I don't know what it's like to be a squirrel, but I've never again seen a squirrel crying over the death of their mother or father or child. Maybe it happens in secret, but I suspect it doesn't, because I don't think anyone has ever seen that. So I can assume maybe that a squirrel doesn't experience grief or sadness, not in the way that we human beings do. And my experience of grief and sadness is it's a very beautiful, tender human emotion. I wouldn't really want to live this life without that emotion. And yet so often we human beings are trying to avoid feeling sad. We're trying to avoid feeling grief. We shut that down, we repress it, we push it off to the side. And so part of what I'm hoping to do by sharing talks like this one is to help you really open up to this experience of being a human being and how rich and how beautiful it is. So for many of us, this requires some spiritual work and development, and that's what these talks and my teaching in general is designed to help us do. Okay, so again, it's not this way for everybody, but for many people, the first thing that happens is being called. Okay, now this can show up in many different forms, and one is maybe you hear a spiritual talk or you read a book by a spiritual teacher and something inside you goes, yes, I don't understand it, but yes, I'm going to follow this teacher, or I'm going to follow this teaching. Many of my students are in yoga, and so maybe you remember that first yoga class that you went to, and maybe just something went off inside of you that said, yes, I'm going to devote energy and time to this. There's something here. You may not have been able to explain it to anybody else, but there was just this sense that, yes, there's something here I need to explore. Sometimes it doesn't happen the first time you take yoga. Some of you have expressed to me that the first time you took my class, you had a similar kind of thing. Maybe you were already doing yoga and mainly for exercise, and then you came to a class of mine and something again inside you said, oh yes, there's something here. I need to pursue this. I need to work with this teacher. I need to come to this class, whatever it is. There are other forms that are essentially the same thing, but they may not seem like it on the surface. One of them is the dark night of the soul. So dark night of the soul, this can show up as depression, anxiety, a personal loss like a death of a loved one or a pet, illness, addiction even. All of these things can be something that brings you to the point where you recognize that really your ego, that thing that is trying to control your life and fix everything and fix you and manage your life, is just, it's not working anymore. Again, for many people, this comes through something like depression, that no matter how hard you try and shake it, you just can't. It just is there. There's a sense of emptiness, and you can't fill it up. I think some people in recovery and in addiction work, I've heard it said that somebody said, I had a God-sized hole in my life and I was trying to fill it with alcohol. So this is a great example of that. There's something missing, and that can result in depression, again, addiction, or maybe we had it all figured out. we married our sweetheart, we have 3 beautiful children, we have a home and a good job, and then the doctor comes and says, you have terminal cancer and you have 3 months to live, or something like this. So again, this story that our ego has crafted about the direction of our life and the meaning of our life, all of a sudden that rug gets pulled out from under us, and we start questioning, what does all this mean? What is the purpose of a human life? If I can be doing everything right, according to my ego, I'm working hard, I'm taking care of my family, I'm raising my kids, I'm not breaking any laws, I'm doing my best, and then I find out I have cancer, like, what is this really all about? I'm playing by the rules, I'm a good person, and then this happens to me. This is sometimes where people will lose their religion. If they've been raised in a religious tradition or something like that, they might lose their faith at this point. And again, that might get you to question your religion, but hopefully that in that process you actually go deeper into your spirituality, and you begin, through questioning your blind faith, you actually find real faith. That would be my hope. It doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes people, they find out that they have illness, or someone close to them dies, and they were in a spiritual tradition or religion, and they just simply drop it all. They get really angry. They might get angry at God, or conclude that God doesn't exist, something like that. So these are all actually doorways or opportunities towards moving deeper into spirituality. And again, we generally do that by starting to question the narratives that maybe we grew up with, whether that's a narrative, again, about God and about religion and about how heaven and hell work, and being a good person, what that means, what that results in. Or it could be just in terms of society. Again, we grow up, at least in this country, often with this sort of narrative that if you work hard and you are a good person, then you're going to be rewarded with a home, a nice car, a nice family, healthy family. Maybe you won't be rich, but you'll be well off, you'll get to retire well, play golf, whatever it is. And some people find that they either follow this and they get all the things, they get the car, the house, the kids, the family, the job, but again, there's a hole there. Or the other possibility, there are many, of course, but one other possibility is that you do all those things and then tragedy strikes and takes it away from you suddenly. And again, there are many ways: illness, death of a loved one, loss of your career or job, something like that, depression, something you can't shake, addiction, or maybe you have a child who's addicted to something, and that just shakes your belief or understanding in the system, the kind of status quo, the narrative that you've been told that if you do these things, everything's going to be okay. What happens when you do everything that you were told and things aren't okay? So this, again, I'm kind of, as a group, categorizing this as being called deeper, being called to begin to question the things that you've been told that maybe you just accepted at face value. Maybe your pastor or your preacher or your meditation teacher or your parents or your teachers or your friends told you this story about how things work. If you do this, this, and this, you're going to be happy, you're going to be content, you're going to be satisfied. I can't speak for everybody, but I know I grew up with those types of narratives. I didn't grow up in religion, but they came just through the society in general that, follow these steps and you're going to be happy or fulfilled. And for better or worse, for me, very early on, those things began breaking down, and I saw that following those guidelines was not going to fulfill me or lead to my fulfillment. And so, because that happened so early to me, much of my life has been outside of what most people would see as the normal thing to do, the sort of standard narrative. Because anytime I've plugged into that and tried to make that work, it hasn't worked for me. Now, another thing I'd like to point out is that this doesn't necessarily happen all at once, or it isn't necessarily an event. As I mentioned, for me, this was maybe all part of growing up, kind of finding that what other people were accepting as normal or okay or were finding satisfying, I was finding it very empty, and I was finding I had to go elsewhere to answer questions. And the first place I went was philosophy. That ended up ultimately being a dead end, but I learned a lot that has been very valuable for me. So I can't say it was a waste of time. It maybe was a dead end, but walking down that road gave me a lot that then I used throughout the rest of my life. So honestly, I don't know that there have been any useless travels in my life. Even if I explore something and it ends up not bringing me what I was looking for, that is part of the path that takes me to the next place. So again, a great example for me is I studied philosophy in university. It was in a philosophy class that I first was exposed to the idea of meditation and the benefits of meditation. That caused me to go home and talk with friends, and that led to me being kind of put in touch with someone who was going to a meditation center. I started going to that meditation center, and then that eventually led to my spiritual awakening. So again, this was something that that sort of calling came to me very early in life, even though I didn't know what that meant, that sort of questioning. And I had experienced bouts of depression. I was someone who would struggle with anxiety and things like that. So this was something that, again, was with me very early on when other kids were maybe just enjoying, being young and, drinking alcohol and smoking pot and doing all that stuff. For me, there was a deeper sort of unease that was there, and I didn't necessarily enjoy the things that most kids were enjoying. I couldn't distract myself with the same sorts of things. So again, philosophy was one avenue to try and answer these deeper questions. There was a yearning within me. Again, I'm calling that the calling. This yearning was there. And first philosophy, and that didn't take me where I wanted to go. And then eventually that led me to Zen. That's where I found answers. So again, I'll reiterate, not everyone has maybe that experience. I suspect there are people who maybe are born spiritually awake. I don't know, but this is our next phase, I might say. So spiritual awakening / enlightenment, some people will call it enlightenment. In fact, we'll look at a passage where it is called enlightenment. These days, I very often call this a spiritual awakening. And this is not to be confused with being woke or these popular terms that are coming along today. This is about spiritual awakening, which is a much older term than being woke and all those sorts of social things. Nothing wrong with that, but this is just to clarify terms. We're not talking about being awoke. We're talking about spiritual awakening or enlightenment. So spiritual awakening, enlightenment, this is where we wake up to our true nature. This can be an event. It can be a very gradual shift in our identity, our understanding of things. It can be several events. And so for me, it was definitely several events, as long as a long, drawn out sort of realization. So again, there's no one way this happens. Some people, while meditating, they have an experience. Other people, they start meditating and then one day they realize something. It can happen any number of ways. Again, for me, I started meditating with no belief or understanding of spiritual awakening. In fact, if you'd asked me when I started meditating if a spiritual awakening was possible, I probably would have said no, because I didn't really believe that there was anything outside of our scientific understanding, you might say. I probably would have tried to explain something like that away with brain chemistry or neurons firing or something like that, and probably in an attempt to kind of diminish its importance, if I'm going to be honest. But what's interesting about life is when you have an experience, it's very different than theory and theorizing about it. So sure enough, meditation works if you apply yourself in the right way, whether you believe it or not. That's the beauty of it. So I didn't have to believe in spiritual awakening to have one. I didn't have to believe that meditation rewires your brain for it to rewire my brain, which is essentially, again, if I'm talking in scientific terms, that's what happened essentially, is I started meditating and it was rather quick for me. I started having a shift in my perspective that was unmistakable. There was no mistaking that something was happening, something was shifting, something was awakening within me. And it was a very powerful experience, but it was also very disorienting. And that's going to lead me sort of to the next part of what we talk about, which is cleaning up. Okay, so the first stage is the calling, being called. The next stage is waking up, and then the final stage is cleaning up. So anyway, waking up, that's what it was for me, and I had several very powerful kind of, you might say, events where there was a realization, just kind of a knowingness that awoke within me. And then I've had also just a more gradual progression of understanding the nature of what happened to me and what I was experiencing, and also just understanding the way that traditions speak about what happened. So there can be some confusion sometimes when you are within a tradition and the way that tradition describes the awakening process or that experience of awakening. Sometimes that doesn't line up, and that can lead to confusion as well. So I just want to point that out. You may have had a legitimate awakening experience, and yet you may discount that because it doesn't look like Eckhart's experience, it doesn't look like Byron Katie's experience, it doesn't look like whatever. So speaking of Eckhart Tolle and Byron Katie, let's look at their experience. I've shared some of mine so far, but for both Byron Katie and Eckhart Tolle, their calling was a deep depression. A deep depression. In the case of Eckhart, he was suicidal. He said he was just basically too chicken to kill himself, but if he could have killed himself, he would have, because the depression was so dark. So again, this is a dark night of the soul, what could be described as a dark night of the soul. And that depression, basically over time, the suffering he was having was so intense, it was like a fire that was burning away his personal identity, his ego. And so he had that depression for, years and years, maybe even decades. And then one night he had an awakening experience, a very powerful one, where he was in bed. He said, I hate myself. He had that thought, I hate myself. And then he stopped for a second. He said, wait a second. It sounds like there's two of me. The I who hates myself. All right, that's interesting. There's an I here who hates myself. And then in that moment, he, I think, heard a voice in his head that said, resist nothing. And then he sort of went through this swooshing experience. He passed out and he woke up in the morning and everything was different. That's a very powerful awakening experience. Now here's the thing, that's not how it happens for most people. Okay, so again, very romantic, very powerful, very visceral description. Many of you might be thinking, well, I want that. Oh, that's awesome. He woke up and like everything was different. How cool, I want that. Well, what you have to hear is the first part, right? His calling. What was his calling? Decades of depression. Are you really ready to go through that kind of torture for that length of time? Because that's what it takes to have that kind of an awakening, okay? So it's very important before we go romanticizing someone else's experience and saying, well, I wish I was like Eckhart Tolle. Be careful what you wish for. Be careful what you wish for, because I doubt even Eckhart would sign up for what he went through. Okay, the end result's beautiful, sure. And now he's on the other side of it. So he might say, yes, that was worth it. But while he was in it, if you told him, hey, yeah, enlightenment's just on the other side of this, you just wait 10 years, I don't think he would have said, okay, cool. That's cool. Let's do it. So worth bearing in mind. Byron Katie, another teacher I like, she had a very similar experience. She had checked herself into a halfway house because she felt like she was just such a monster. I think other people were calling her that. She's very scary. Hard to imagine if you see her today. She's so loving and just beautiful in her presentation of self. But back then she was a tall, big woman, scary, angry. And so she was also depressed. So she checked herself into this halfway house so she could isolate from the rest of the world for a while, get herself straight maybe. And I think she said she felt so unworthy, she didn't really feel like she deserved the bed, so she would sleep on the floor, if you can imagine. So one day she wakes up on the floor and she looks at her foot and she sees a roach on her foot. I hope I'm recalling these stories correctly. I'm pretty sure I am, but it's been a minute, so there may be discrepancies in my memory of these stories, but more or less the gist of it should be right. So she saw a roach on her foot, and she realized in that moment, for whatever reason, that if she believed her thoughts, she suffered. And if she questioned her thoughts, suffering wasn't there. This is, again, a very powerful realization, a very powerful awakening. So she, I think, almost immediately checked herself out of the halfway house and went home. And immediately people realized that something had changed with her. She went home to her family. So again, very powerful, very romantic. We might think, that's what I want. Sign me up for that. But again, you need to look at the whole story. So again, years and years of really deep depression. Again, people were scared of her. So imagine if people in your life were terrified of you. What kind of person would you have to be? We look at Eckhart, we look at Byron Katie today, and we think, oh, they're so wonderful. And but what was she like before? It sounds like she was a very scary, miserable person. Most of us don't really want to go there. Okay? So again, cause and effect, we very often might covet the result, but are we actually willing to sign up for the path to get there? If most of us are really honest with ourselves, we aren't. We aren't willing to suffer that much to have that kind of an awakening. So anyway, this is spiritual awakening. And again, I think in this passage I'm going to share with you later, he calls it enlightenment. So I tend to these days reserve that term enlightenment for maybe a different phase of the spiritual journey, but I can't say that it's wrong necessarily. It just sort of depends. These are terms, it's semantics. Different teachers and different traditions might have different definitions and ways of looking at things. So cleaning up. Interestingly, you may think, well, Eckhart Tolle, Byron Katie, they woke up and that was it. Completely clean and clear. And everyone recognized how wise they were right away, and they started teaching right away, right? Wrong. both of them had periods of cleaning up. So Eckhart, he, I think, became essentially homeless, and he lived on the bench in a park. Even if he wasn't homeless, I know he went to the park a lot, and he would just sit and watch the ducks. And he just sat quietly. And this is an experience for many teachers, is after a certain phase or stage in their awakening process, they might go into silence for a very long time. They might retreat for a period of time. And it's not uncommon. And that's essentially what Eckhart did, I think, for many years, actually. He didn't start teaching right away. He basically went into a form of seclusion, which again is not uncommon. And then Byron Katie, she recalls spending a lot of time in the desert. So she was in New Mexico, and she would drive out to the desert and go out there into the desert and lay down, and from what I can gather, maybe actually sleep out there in the desert. And again, this is a very similar to, I think, Jesus Christ spent 40 days out in the desert, after his awakening, you might say. So again, we see a very common theme, very common for teachers, people on a path like this, to, after an awakening experience. And again, some people can have several, and some people might retreat at various periods, but not uncommon for them to go away and to have that period of maturation. For me, after my awakening, there was a lot of confusion, and it was, I think, just part of where I had come from, where I was going. My experience was so powerful, it was very disorienting, and it didn't blow my ego out completely. So there was still, once the initial experiences sort of settled in, and this is very common, the ego comes back in and begins creating trouble again. And so that's where a lot of the confusion was, a lot of a kind of a tug of war. And so I had sort of a second period of not awakening, but I would say really surrendering to the path that was before me, because I think before that the ego had enough energy where it was still trying to dictate the trajectory of my life, what it thought my life was supposed to look like. And at this point, I really don't have a vision of what my life is supposed to look like. But at that time, I was very young. That's the other thing I'll say is Byron Katie, Eckhart Tolle, they were much older than I was when I had my awakening experience. So I had kind of my whole life ahead of me, really. And, I wasn't looking for spiritual awakening when I started meditating. I wasn't looking for anything, really. I was just maybe questioning things. And I didn't even go to meditation to find answers. I went to meditation because a teacher had said, oh, well, it helps with concentration, it'll lower your blood pressure. He listed a bunch of things on a blackboard. And I was like, oh, great, that sounds great. And when I went there, I'm half Japanese, so I had early childhood and youthful experiences in Japan. It's a beautiful culture, in my opinion. And I went to this zendo, and it was full of, these sort of Japanese decorations and incense. It was very familiar in many ways. So it was quiet, which was very different. And I enjoyed it. And so I started going. And again, in my mind, there was zero chance of me having some kind of a spiritual awakening experience, because I didn't really think that was possible. So I think that was actually helpful for me because I had basically zero expectation. So I just took what came, and what came was what I would define as a spiritual awakening. And again, I had several periods of that within the course of a few years when I was finishing up university. So that's the time I was doing that, and I had just several very, very powerful experiences. When I was done, though, with university, I basically had this idea that, okay, I've seen all this stuff with spirituality, but I have my whole life ahead of me, and I need to get on with building my life, and the spirituality will probably just get in the way of that. So I actually had this sort of idea of, well, let me go ahead and get my life in order, make a lot of money, be successful, and then I can really focus on Zen and meditation and spirituality. What I didn't realize is that wasn't going to work. The ego, while it wasn't completely gone, it had been mortally wounded. And the ego has a certain kind of energy to it, and it's powerful. If you look at the titans of industry and the movers and shakers in our world, like top musicians and people who are really dominant in a field, generally speaking, that's going to be ego energy, even in spirituality, as strange as that might sound. A lot of people who are dominant, in terms of like yoga teachers or, people who are just all over the place, a lot of times that's just that same ego energy that is propelling that. Once, at least in my case, I'll say, once I had woken up spiritually, my ego it wasn't gone, it wasn't out, but it was like mortally wounded. And so its energy, its ability to do and achieve things was just not there. It would just sort of peter out at a certain point. And again, that led to a lot of frustration and confusion because I was being called onto a spiritual path, and my ego was, wounded, but it was crawling in another direction. And so what I needed was another sort of wake up, an opportunity to really surrender. And as I said in the first part with the calling, it was almost like a second calling. It was almost like calling me back to the Dharma, calling me back to the path. So I had an illness, I had a bankruptcy, basically my life completely collapsed, and I surrendered. I just was like, okay, I don't know what I'm doing, I don't know how things should go, and I gave in to my Dharma, to my path, and that led me to where I am today, sharing with you. So it wasn't, a straight line, but it was pretty straight. It was pretty fast. The connection was made once I said, okay, not my way, but thy way, what would you like me to do? Universe, God, spirit, true nature, what is your agenda for this vessel? Very quickly, I was put on the path that I'm on now. And I've never felt like I belonged so much as where I am now. In the past, I had a passion, I think I shared in another video, for music. While I love music still, and I still love playing music, and there's a certain kind of camaraderie with musicians, there's also still a disconnect. And I don't feel that same disconnect when I am surrounded by people who have done really honest, deep spiritual work. There is almost a sense of a lack of separation between myself and those people. It really is almost like a direct understanding. So it's a little hard to describe, but I don't, as much as I love music, I don't necessarily feel that same bonding with musicians, even though I do feel a strong bond with musicians. Many of my longtime friends are friends who I made through playing music. There's definitely something transcendent about playing music, especially with a group. It can be such a powerful, ecstatic experience. But spirituality is even beyond an ecstatic experience. It's something deeper. And if you've ever had the joy of maybe sitting in silent meditation with others for long periods of time, you might find that there is a sense of closeness and intimacy that develops with those people that you maybe have never experienced before, even though you're not really talking much or at all. There can just be this beautiful sense of connection that develops there. So again, just sharing part of my journey. I was somebody who there was enough ego still intact that, my ego said, okay, spirituality is great, but you can come back to that later in life. Let's go, make some money, have a career, maybe get a family. But it was too badly wounded. That's just the best way I could describe it. It didn't have the energy and the stamina to do that. So while I watched other people basically build their lives up with that sort of ego energy, and I want to be clear here, I'm not trying to demonize the ego. It's there or it's not. And while spirituality really is about ultimately sort of seeing through the ego structure and dismantling it, it serves its own purpose. So I'm not trying to say that other people who are driven by that ego energy are evil or bad, okay? Or that when I was doing that, I was evil or bad. So anyway, ego was mortally wounded, but still kind of dragging me off my dharma, off my path. And then basically it collapsed with that experience of bankruptcy. So financial failure, and then also I ended up in surgery, which that's the only surgery I've really had in my life. Generally, my health is very, very good. I don't have to go to the hospital or see doctors usually, but that was a case where I couldn't avoid it. It was unavoidable. So those two things, the hospitalization led to the bankruptcy, which is often the case for people in my country. Very often you end up in surgery. If it's something that's not covered by insurance or something like that, there's some technicality, then you end up going bankrupt. It's the number one cause of bankruptcy in our country. So regardless, that was very much a defeat for me. In my family, declaring bankruptcy was shameful. It wasn't accepted. Some people see it as, oh yeah, it's just business. That's how you do it. If you don't have enough money, you just declare bankruptcy and continue on. But for me, that wasn't how I was raised. That wasn't what I believed. I had worked for many years prior trying to actually dig myself out of debt, working very, very hard, trying to dig myself out of debt. And then it just basically, the surgery just collapsed that whole thing. It was not going to happen. It was clear. So again, there really was a sense of failure there and being crushed. And again, very often with that dark night calling, it was a sense of what I believed and what I held to be true and what I believed about myself and the world. I just couldn't uphold that anymore. The ego couldn't hold that and move forward. So I guess the ultimate would have been I just would have killed myself at that point. That would have been the only way out of that, the only escape. But if I were to move forward another day, then I had to let go of that belief system, which is what essentially happened. So that brings us to our last phase, which is the cleaning up phase. And this is something that takes a long time. And for many people interested in spirituality today, this is actually the main place where you should be focusing your work, is on cleaning up. So awakening allows us to clean up. Before we're spiritually awake, we're not going to be able to clean up because we don't know up from down, left from right, front from back before we wake up spiritually. So waking up to our true nature, whether it's complete or partial, that's the kind of prerequisite. And again, I suspect some people are actually born with that perspective. So I don't know that everyone needs to go through those first two in order to begin cleaning up, but you might. So waking up to your true nature, again, whether we call that spiritual awakening or enlightenment or satori, doesn't really matter. Those are just names. We have a shift in perspective on what we think we are, the nature of reality. And again, that could be an event or it could be a gradual shift. But after the honeymoon period, and you can check out, I've given a talk about the honeymoon period before. During the honeymoon period of spiritual awakening, very often the ego is out for the count. It's not gone, but it's just knocked out for a little while. You've transcended it. It's too confused to orient itself. So it's just sort of laying back or asleep. And that is a very beautiful experience for most people, very powerful experience, and sometimes very confusing, because if you're not careful, you might think that you know everything now and that you're enlightened, so you're done. That now you can go and teach other people, you always know what's right, you don't need to listen to spiritual teachers anymore, they don't have anything to offer you, you can correct other people about their spiritual views, this kind of thing. There's a lack of humility in that oftentimes. This is a very, very dangerous place to be. So you really want to check into that and make sure that that's not what's happening for you. But again, very often there can be a sort of rejection of guidance, dogmatism often comes in with this, and exclusivity, where again, I have it or my group has it or whatever, other people don't, looking down on other groups or other people. These can often come as the ego begins to reorient itself after the initial awakening. So again, for many people, the awakening is experienced because the ego is temporarily out. Then as the ego begins to come back in and try and understand what happened, it co-opts the experience. The ego, the small self, had nothing to do with the awakening experience. Again, we had that experience because our sense of self has dropped away, our usual sense of self. So we have this expansive, transcendent experience. Well, then this ego comes back and says, that's me. I am that, or I had that, or whatever it is, and nothing could be further from the truth. But it's not uncommon for people to make that mistake. So this is a very tricky time, and I find that there are many people interested in spirituality, and this is where they are. They are maybe awake, either partially or completely awake, but there's still a lot of cleaning up that needs to be done. And so I'd like to share with you one of my favorite teachers, a Zen teacher, from a book called Dream Conversations, and it's Muso Kokushi, or Muso Soseki, I think he's also goes by that name. And he was a Zen master who lived a long time ago. He's someone that my Zen teacher introduced me to, and just one of the most clear and powerful enlightened teachers I think I've ever read. Highly recommend the book if you want to check it out. But I've taken an excerpt that I want to share with you about this sort of cleaning up process and this whole stages of development process. So he doesn't go through it exactly the same way that I have, but you'll see hopefully some commonality there. Okay, so the first section is called Intent and Expression, and this will give us hopefully some context or background. According to an ancient saying, those who have not yet attained enlightenment, so what I'm calling spiritual awakening most of the time, should study the intent rather than the expression, while those who've attained enlightenment should study the expression rather than the intent. The intent is the inner meaning of Zen, which is the fundamental that is inherent in everyone. So that's a very important little passage. The fundamental which is inherent in everyone. So part of spiritual awakening is realizing your true nature, the fundamental ground of being, and also recognizing that that's all that there really is. It's as much in you as it is in anyone else. Someone else may not recognize it, but if you're trying to deny it in them, then you clearly don't know what it is. He goes on to say, the expression is the varied methodology of the Zen schools. The intent is the root. The expression is the branches. Students first need to find out the inner meaning of Zen, not getting bogged down in expressions. So another example of this that I might use is also from the Zen tradition, where they say that when someone is pointing at the moon, look at the moon and not the finger that's pointing at the moon, okay? So very often students will get obsessed with the behavior of a teacher. They'll get obsessed with which school is better, which method is better, or what's more true. They'll debate all kinds of terms. They'll get lost in, all kinds of spiritual games, really. And what he's saying here is that's a mistake if you haven't yet woken up. So if you're not yet awake, or even if you've had a little bit of awakening, but there's a lot of confusion there, then you want to focus on the roots, right? So the intent. What is the teaching pointing to? And again, this is very, very important. All of these talks ultimately are pointing us to something. Some of them more directly, and some of them more indirectly. Everything I do, whether it's teaching postures in yoga, meditation, breathing techniques, energetic work, whether it's lecturing like I'm doing now, or quoting from a text or scripture, all of it is ultimately pointing you to something, or helping with the other part, which is the cleaning up part. So I'm going to continue now with the next passage. After realizing the intent of Zen, people in ancient times used to spend decades polishing themselves thoroughly in order to free themselves from compulsions of conditioning and habit. This is very, very important, everyone. And this is where I think in modern spirituality, this is the work that many people need to be doing, including in this community. So if you're one of my students, it's likely this is where your focus is. If you haven't yet woken up, again, this teaching also will help with that. Spiritual awakening, again, the direct pointing, and we can have a session where we can talk more directly about that. But again, many of you are at least partially awake. And so it really is more this process of what I'm calling cleaning up. Okay? So again, after realizing the intent, what is the finger pointing to, right? Once you see the moon, after realizing the intent of Zen, people in ancient times used to spend decades polishing themselves thoroughly in order to free themselves from compulsions of conditioning and habit. Compulsions of conditioning and habit. These are our old routines. These are our triggers. These are our defenses, our ego defenses. These are our assumptions about the world and about other people. Interestingly, just because you wake up, it does not mean all of these disappear. Maybe in the case of an Eckhart Tolle, maybe most, if not all of them, fell away. But again, we even see in Eckhart and Byron Katie's examples, they spent time in solitude. And I think what was happening for them is just this final sort of cleaning up period of realizing the full full impact of what they had seen, and sort of going through the ideas that may still be there and running the programs that are running, and just sort of debunking those. So this is something that I'm devoting more and more time to in my work as a teacher, because I find that actually it's not been that difficult for me to wake people up. Many people who come on my retreats, we haven't done one over the last couple of years, but many people who've done those retreats with me had genuine, powerful spiritual awakening experiences. Not everybody, and some people that might have planted the seed for that to happen later. But this has happened for many of my students, real, authentic spiritual awakening and realization. But like so many people, that doesn't mean the work is done. So he's saying here, in ancient times, people used to spend decades polishing themselves thoroughly in order to free themselves of compulsions, of conditioning, and habit. Very, very important step. Okay, seeing through our assumptions. So I've been studying with a teacher to learn a method of inquiry, which is a non-dual spiritual technique that is used in conjunction often with meditation. So I've taught many of you meditation. If you're not already doing meditation, I highly recommend it, because meditation may be enough to do this work. If meditation is really understood properly and practiced regularly, usually still in contact with the teacher, it's a very good idea if you're meditating and you've been meditating and we have not had a conversation in a long time. It's a very good idea for you to reach out and speak to me. And as most of you know, I'm working on a donation basis, so money does not need to be an object. I definitely appreciate the contribution, but I don't want anyone to prevent themselves from talking with me because they don't think they can afford it. Okay? So again, if you're wondering what that would cost or what it should cost, I can tell you easily what my normal rate is, what I normally make for my time. But if you're concerned that that's too much, you won't be able to afford that, then by all means reach out, because it's still much more important for me to help you, okay? So meditation can be enough, but it often isn't. There are often areas where there's just the roots are so deep that we are not able to free ourselves just with meditation alone. And so that's where inquiry comes in. Inquiry is something that you will need to learn with me working one-on-one first. However, once you get the hang of it, it is something you can do on your own. Many people find that they prefer to do it with someone else, or that a combination of doing it on their own and with someone else. But it is something that it's recommended that you work with me first to learn. And that's something I'll be rolling out here soon. So it shouldn't be too much longer. Anyway, very important point there. He goes on to say here, this is called the work of maturation. The completion of maturation is called the attainment of unification. Now this again I think is significant, because even though the Zen tradition and the yoga tradition are not one tradition, they actually do have very similar roots. Buddha was a yogi before he became the Buddha. So we can see those traditions as Buddhism actually flowering out of the yoga tradition if we want. He didn't find what he was looking for in yoga, but I would not deny that there were perhaps yoga teachers who had realized what Buddha had realized. Okay, he just didn't find one of those teachers. So he took those roots and then went beyond and came up with something very valuable. So in a very real sense, I think it was good he didn't find a teacher who gave him the answers he was looking for. In many ways, I think he was able to push spirituality in his local environment further than it was being understood at the time. And this is very common. Even very powerful spiritual teachings and traditions, over time they tend to get dull and lifeless. And so somebody comes along who reinvigorates them and brings maybe a new interpretation. This has happened in the yogic tradition, in the Vedic and Brahmanic tradition. It's also happened in Buddhism. It's happened in Christianity. It's happened in Islam. So very, very common in spirituality that over time a institution that's been around for a long time can get very, very dull and heavy, dogmatic, where it's no longer really serving spirit. It's simply serving its own institutionalization. It's just keeping itself going. And people are getting a little taste of spirituality, but not enough to actually wake them up or help them once they've woken up. Okay, so we go on to the last area here, and it's called living Zen. After the stage of unification, various subtle capacities and functions appear spontaneously. In yoga, these are called the siddhis. Oh, a point I wanted to make about maturation, he says, this is called the attainment of unification. Unification is one of the words for translations for the word yoga. So again, unification. This is really what this is all about, you might say, okay? So after the stage of unification, various subtle capacities and functions appear spontaneously. The methods employed by such adepts for helping others thus derive from freedom. This is important because when you're working with a fully realized teacher, they may not always cite scripture. They may not always cite tradition. They may not even go along with tradition. They might even contradict tradition or scripture, seemingly. Okay? And again, this is derived from freedom. A teacher who's reached that level has the freedom of expression to, you could say, point to the moon with their finger, with their elbow, with their head, with anything. They can use anything as a teaching. By contrast, someone who has not first realized the intent, the ground of being, and then is not cleaned up, very often will actually create more confusion by their pointing or what they think. And again, this is something we see happening in spirituality, where the teacher's understanding is not really very complete, and there can be a lot of confusion and problems that's created by that. So the methods employed by such adepts for helping others thus derive from freedom. They are not products of conventional learning. Okay, so again, these teachers are not necessarily sitting down, studying Yoga Sutras, and then just trying to regurgitate Yoga Sutras as they learned it in teacher training or as they read it in a book. Their interpretation of a scripture, a passage of a teaching, may be quite different. And they may also use other things like science, discoveries in science, or other traditions or religions. They might pull from other places, okay? This quality of freedom and spontaneity is referred to as being alive. And some of you have heard me say, my teaching is really about being fully alive, fully human, to the full range of human experience. That's really, for me, more valuable than anything. Having some out-of-body experience, that might be nice, but that's not really why we have bodies. We don't really have bodies so that we can spend a lot of time outside of our bodies. Same with our emotions. Some people think that being spiritual is like not feeling any emotion, never feeling sadness, never feeling anger, never having any things. This isn't my experience. These emotions are so rich. Why would we not want to experience them? Rather, we want to be able to experience them and know we'll be okay. Right? That's what so many of us don't understand, is we will be okay. We can experience human emotions and be okay. Such people are said to have attained both intent and expression, and what they say is called the living word. So again, we see another, you could say, reference to another tradition. God was the Word and spoke the Word, right? The Word. Jesus, in some interpretations of that passage in the Bible, is said to have been the Word. So the living Word, a teacher at this stage who has both woken up and cleaned up, is unified, and then is able to teach from a place of freedom. She is no longer bound by tradition or what some teacher in the past said or someone else's interpretation of what is happening. So this is ultimately where we all go. I really don't think it's a good idea for everyone who is studying spirituality to then think that they need to go become a spiritual teacher. This is absolutely not the case. Most people shouldn't be a spiritual teacher. It's a certain calling, it's a certain gift. And again, if you're like me, you might try and actually avoid that and find that no matter how much you try, you can't avoid it. So that's how callings very often are. Are most people called to be a spiritual teacher? Absolutely not. Having said that, in A Course in Miracles, it says that we're all teachers, and I really believe that. So you teach every moment of every day what you believe yourself to be. You teach others what you believe them to be and what you believe you are and what you believe the world is. Okay? Ultimately, my experience is we don't know what any of it is. It really is a mystery. I don't really know what I am. No word or description or name does it justice. I experience what I am, but and in that you could say I know, but I don't know intellectually. I don't really have a concept that does justice my experience of what I am. And that's also true of this place and of you and of everything I experience. It's a very mysterious thing. It's a very beautiful thing, but it's not something I can understand or conceptualize. I might use conceptualizations, I might use words, I might use descriptions, I might use names, but I'm using them and they aren't using me. There's a huge difference. So again, all the words, traditions, all of these concepts are fingers. So I use them to point at the moon, but I'm not being used by them. I am not bound or shackled by them. And even though it is my job, profession, or calling to be a teacher, I'm also teaching when I'm not teaching. And you are too. That's my point. So you are teaching your children, you are teaching your spouse, you are teaching the person who's checking you out at the grocery store, you are teaching your waiter when you go out to eat, you're teaching others in traffic, you are teaching always. So it is inescapable. So this is where this, in a sense, applies to everybody. This is the path that we all want to take.